Dickens wasn't the first person to say Merry Christmas, okay, or to write Merry Christmas, but he wrote it so many times. If you can get a Google copy of the book, like Google Merry, and start looking for it, it's all over the place. It's used many, many times. Everyone agrees that the popularity of merry versus happy in America was because of A Christmas Carol.
Hello, and welcome to the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. My name is Bob Perry, and I'm the museum's director. We make our home in the last and largest boiler house of the former Boston Manufacturing Company, and what is now known as the Francis Cabot Lowell Mill. This former textile mill was founded in 1813 and was the precursor to the great mills of Lowell and many other well-known New England mill cities and towns that proliferated beginning in 1822. At that time, Lowell was known as East Chelmsford, but in 1826 was renamed Lowell in honor of the visionary founder of this very mill, the one that started it all. My personal journey learning history is ongoing, as I suppose is true for us all. And I knew and was quite pleased, given where I worked, that Charles Dickens had visited Lowell and had come away quite favorably impressed, particularly with the working conditions that contrasted starkly with those he had earlier observed at the English mills in Manchester. But there was a good deal more to Dickens's visits to the United States that I didn't know, and this talk is going to fill in major gaps for me. Of course, who hasn't either read A Christmas Carol or seen one or more film or stage adaptations of that classic story? The tale is familiar, but I certainly didn't know how A Christmas Carol came to be, and I definitely wasn't aware of its impact on our culture. I suspect you may not have been aware of its cultural impact either, which is quite possibly explaining why you're here in this audience. Thank goodness for Susan Wilson, whom I didn't know either until recently, as she is about to enlighten us on those very subjects, and just in time for Christmas. Susan Wilson is a widely respected photographer, author, and public historian who has written and lectured about Boston history for the past 3 decades. She's the official house historian of the Omni Parker House, an affiliate scholar at Brandeis University's Women's Studies Research Center, and an honorary fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Her most recent books are Heaven by Hotel Standards, The History of the Omni Parker House, published in 2019, and Women and Children First, The Trailblazing Life of Susan Dimock, MD, published in 2023. Finally, you should know that tonight's Mill Talk is made possible by the generous support of the Lowell Institute, an organization that has been funding free lectures throughout Greater Boston since 1839. As it happens, a few years before Charles Dickens' first visit to America. Please welcome Susan Wilson.
I think he told it all. I think we're done. Good. Okay, I just wanted to ask, how many people were at the Parker House Saturday night? Just you two? Okay. All right, so no one else knows the story yet. All right. We did a Saturday night at the Parker House. Somebody every year does a performance of A Christmas Carol, and I was honored to do the intro there. But this is the full-blown version, so you guys get to learn more. Okay, let's get started. Can everyone hear me? Okay? We're good? Okay. We're going to go back a little bit further than Dickens' arrival, just to get a context so you understand what was happening. Anyone know when Boston was founded? 1620, that's carved on a rock in a different town. Yeah, okay. 1620 is Plymouth, 1630 is Boston, yeah. So think about it, in 7 years we're going to be at 400 years. And most of the towns in and around Boston, or within the 128 complex, which wasn't here then, most of the towns were founded during the 1630s. Anyway, we have to go back to the Puritans because this is part of our story. I love this map. If you take a look at this, this is when the Puritans and the Mass Bay Colony first came here in 1630 and decided to stay in what we now call Boston. The areas that are the light tan are what existed. The darker brown, the blue is the water, okay? But the darker brown is all made land. Okay, my friend Nancy Seasholes, the archaeologist, says, don't call it landfill because they weren't filling in land, they were filling in water. Okay, so we're supposed to call it made land. But it's pretty profound. I mean, I think we all know that the Back Bay was actually a bay, and during high tide it all flooded. But to see, I mean, Logan Airport, is a bunch of little islands, but mostly made land. Anyway, so when they came, this is what it looked like, and this is, you can see the green area is Boston Common, just to get a sense of, who's located where. Now, the guys that came seem pretty innocent. Here's a bunch of Puritans. Anyone know why they were called Puritans? Excellent. They wanted to purify the Church of England. And the reason they wanted to purify the Church of England was they thought there was too much stuff like the Catholic Church, which of course the Church of England broke off from and imitated. But there was too much frivolous stuff, like, too much expense, too much stained glass, music, all kinds of frivolous things, people wearing, bold costumes and having all kinds of expensive accoutrements. And they felt that they wanted to get it down to the pure and simple. And so they were called the Puritans. I love that we always talk about America being founded on religious freedom. Okay, so religious freedom for the Puritans. They came here for religious freedom, and they gave religious freedom to you if you were a Puritan. If you were, oh, the ghosts are here. Okay, that just left the premises. Okay, do whatever you want. Anyway, religious freedom if you were a Puritan. If you were not a Puritan, you were in deep trouble. If you were standing in front of the State House today and looked to the right, there's a seated woman. She is Mary Dyer. She was a Quaker. This was an evil thing. As you know, Quakers are very dangerous people. And she didn't want to be a Puritan. And so they actually said, if you don't change to Christianity, we're going to hang you. And she said, okay, I'll leave. And she left for a while, but then she said, no, I want to come back because I have things to do here. She was a follower of Anne Hutchinson, who was another uppity woman. And anyway, she came back a second time, and they hanged her for being a Quaker. So, so much for religious freedom. This, by the way, if you were here any time from the time, well, the only tree that was on Boston Common, even before the Puritans got here, was called the Great Elm, and it was huge when they got here, and it lasted up to 1876. There were many different things that were done under it, all kinds of meetings and ceremonies, and there's a plaque where it used to exist. To find it today is very difficult. It's halfway between the Frog Pond and the new Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King Memorial. It's halfway between, but it's just a little plaque in the ground. And it says the Great Elm was here, and that it fell down in 1876, and that some of the Sons of Liberty met there. It's confusing because it isn't the Liberty Tree, but it's okay. But also a bunch of Methodists used to meet around there, and they found the founding of Methodism may have happened there. What's interesting is they don't have written on that plaque that this was the hanging tree, because they used it for all kinds of purposes. So we believe that Mary Dyer and all the other people who were nasty and didn't convert to Christianity were hanged on that tree. Now, religious freedom, okay? Harvard College. Anyone know when Harvard was founded? Are you a grad? He said 1636. You're right. So one of the reasons we're so dang smart in this area is we had education very early on. Founded in 1630, the first public school in America, Boston Latin, 1635, and the first college in British North America, 1636. So Harvard was there from the beginning and believed that they wanted to have the best education possible. And of course, the Puritans really cared about reading the Bible, one of the reasons education was so important. And they met this guy named Judamonas, who was a Hebrew scholar, and he was Jewish, obviously. And they thought, we can learn even more about the Bible and early culture if we have someone on the faculty who will be able to teach us about that. And so they said, Judamonis, we would like to hire you, and we'd like you to be the instructor of Hebrew at Harvard College. However, we can't hire you if you're Jewish. So Judamonis was asked if he wanted to be on the faculty to convert to Christianity. So he went to bed one night as a Jew, woke up the next morning as a Christian, and started teaching. Okay, so there's so much for religious freedom, but we're getting into things that were not allowed. You can see the build here. By the way, the tombstone there, Judamonis, had he maintained his Judaism, would not have been allowed to be buried in Massachusetts because it was illegal for Jews to be buried in Massachusetts until after the 1840s. And therefore, if you wanted to be buried, you had to go to places where it was okay, like Newport or New York. Okay, so here are friendly Puritans. You've all heard of the term banned in Boston. Well, it all started with our friends the Puritans. So among the things that were illegal, you've gotten a sense of it already, adultery, okay. Smoking in public, drunkenness, blasphemy, witchcraft was not allowed, okay. Having cards, dice, or tables in the house, living with Indians, okay. Fancy clothing, okay. Practicing and attending the theater, because we know that people in theater are all immoral. Playing and listening to music, okay, or missing Sunday service. This isn't the complete list, but this is a sampler of the things that you would get fined or maybe even imprisoned or hanged for. Mencken, the great satirist and writer, had this comment: Puritanism is the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy. Okay? So, it's probably no surprise then that Christmas was made illegal. It was frowned upon from the beginning, and in 1659 the General Court said, yes, it is illegal, and if you were found in any way celebrating Christmas, you could be fined 5 shillings. They did have to revoke that later on, but the attitude was there and it stuck. Okay, what is so dangerous about Christmas? Here we go. Have you heard of wassailing? Okay, can anyone tell me what wassailing is? Oh, very good. Drinking alcoholic beverages, and then caroling and carousing or other things that you do when you're drunk out of your mind. Okay, so this actually was a very popular way of celebrating Christmas. Not only in America, but in the old country, in London and England, UK. Wasn't the UK then. Anyway, so it was not uncommon for people of lower socioeconomic classes to get drunk and then to go to the houses of people of higher socioeconomic classes who were probably or also drunk, and banging on their doors and demanding something. Like, for example, let's take a look. Okay, there you go. Okay, should we do a chorus? We wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Okay, so far. Now hold on. Don't get ahead of it. Oh, okay, we're starting to get a demand here, okay? Oh, bring us some figgy pudding, oh, bring us some figgy pudding, oh, bring us some pudding, and bring it right here. Okay, now, watch this. We won't go until we get some, we won't go until we get some, we won't go until we get some, so bring it right here. So, this is just a sampler of, seemingly innocent sampler of what was happening, and one of the reasons people were so upset about wassailing and what people did on Christmas. It was a fairly rowdy thing. Okay, now we have Charles Dickens coming to Boston. Charles Dickens only came to Boston twice in his life, once in 1842, once in 1867. We're going to explore very briefly what happened in 1842. First of all, this probably doesn't look like the Dickens you generally see, because this is him as a kid. Okay, he's only 29 years old. When he came, He did not stay at the Parker House. Okay. Okay, he came to the Tremont House. Now, if you look at this, okay, you can see, if you know Tremont Street, on the left is the Granary Burying Ground. On the right is Tremont Temple. Both of those are still there. A little farther down, you can see in the back, you can see King's Chapel. And on the right is where the Parker House eventually was. On the left is the Tremont House. The reason that he didn't stay, and this is what the Tremont House looked like, it was gorgeous, okay? And on the left is where the Parker House will be. Clearly, the reason he didn't stay at the Parker House, it didn't exist. That's the only reason I can think of. Anyway, this is where he stayed. It was the most gorgeous hotel in town. By the way, the names, Tremont House, Parker House, a lot of the other hotels that grew up in the mid-19th century were called house. There was the Revere House, the American House. And part of this was that they wanted, hotels were really just invented in the 19th century. You didn't miss too much. Come on and sit down. Anyway, they wanted people to think that it was a very kind and gentle place to stay and you'd be taken care of as well as in someone's home. Because prior to that, people mostly stayed in inns and places that were not, well, places that were not as kind and to stay in. Okay, let's just say bars and taverns and that kind of thing. But hotels were very popular. Many of them were called houses, and Tremont House was the place to be. Now, when he came here, he wanted to see a lot of the United States. And there were things that he loved, and there were things that he hated during this first trip. One of the things he thought was deplorable was he saw slavery in the South, and he thought that was awful. And Great Britain and many of the countries in the world had already eliminated slavery. Slave trade had been eliminated, but here we were a little behind, and he thought that was awful. However, he did go up to Lowell, and he thought that was wonderful. Now, I do need to repeat, when we talk about Lowell and the mills there, that it started here, okay? Bob, I promised to say that, and you said it too, okay? Anyway, that when Francis Cabot Lowell decided to do this experiment and begin the Boston Manufacturing Company, he began in Waltham. It's just that Charles River wasn't enough, didn't have enough oomph to make that go, and the Merrimack worked a whole lot better. So the experiment that began here in Waltham was taken up a decade later in the 1820s in Lowell. And they created these mills, and they created this mill town that became known as Lowell. And he was really, really impressed with this, because in England, the factories, well, Dickens spent much of his life writing about how miserable it was and how the conditions were awful. And during the period when he was visiting the Lowell Mill Girls in 1842, things were primo. They were excellent. The place was clean. They were well taken care of. They had shorter work weeks, like maybe only an 80-hour work week. That was a big deal at the time. Okay, so anyway, so he just really thought this was a wonderful thing. We will come back to this later on, but he was impressed by that. Now, he went back to England, and he was supposed to be writing Martin Chuzzlewit, which he did finish. But out of the blue, something that he hadn't even planned, he started writing A Christmas Carol. And apparently he finished it in a very, very short amount of time, a matter of weeks. So, but this wasn't in his master plan. How did that happen? Well, we'll get into that. Anyway, there was A Christmas Carol in one of its early editions. The subtitle, A Ghost Story of Christmas. Now, this is going to build into something else. Okay. We have basically 2 centuries where the Puritan ethic is maintained, where we really don't celebrate Christmas up here. I have to say that in the South, it was actually creeping back and in many cases never left. But the South was already a little bit more like the old country anyway in many ways. But how was it that Christmas started coming back up here? It wasn't just Dickens, there were several different elements. First of all, we no longer have the pure Puritans, okay? Not everyone is from Britain, and many more immigrants from all around the world start coming to America. Who obviously was the biggest group? Irish, okay? We have a huge influx starting in the 1840s of Irish immigrants, but lots of immigrants from other countries, Poland and Germany and Italy, start coming in, Eastern Europe. And so, why would immigrants coming in make a difference? Okay, they bring their culture, okay, but many of these people were from countries that were Roman Catholic or Anglican. What's the Anglican Church in America? Episcopalian, right, okay? So all of those, they came with Christmas with them, or Christmas traditions. So all of a sudden, 1840s, 1850s, and so on, we see this happening. And we see a proliferation of Anglican and Roman Catholic churches. You can see this evil thing, this organ, okay, that's music coming in, okay, at King's Chapel, Old North Church, and also St. Stephen's, which was originally called the New North Church in the North End. Quiz question, does anyone know who had her baptism as well as her funeral at St. Stephen's? Rose Kennedy, excellent. Yeah, because she grew up in the North End. Okay, so there are more elements too. People really, we'd forgotten that we hated England. You know, we were done with the Revolution, we were done with the War of 1812. We were really pals and we really appreciated England. And everybody loved Victoria and Albert. Where was Albert from? Germany. What part of Christmas did the Germans bring for sure? Christmas tree. This is a really smart crowd. Really smart crowd. Anyway, so they published so apparently Albert brought the Christmas tree, and the Queen Victoria and their children all celebrated it, and this image ran in papers in and around London and then was picked up by America's most popular women's magazine called Godey's Ladies' Book in 1850, and Americans went, wow, I really like that, okay? And we're very impressed by that. I just love, doesn't it look like a Charlie Brown Christmas tree or something? Anyway, that was repeated in 1850, again in 1860, and people really started picking up on this. So we see these different elements coming back in, where Christmas is just, people are going, okay, you know, there's something nice happening here. One of the big deals was the very first Christmas tree in the White House was set up by Franklin Pierce in 1856. And again, this was publicized and printed in the papers. So Christmas is creeping in. And even our friend Henry Wadsworth Longfellow mentioned that same year, we are in a transition state about Christmas here in New England. The old Puritan feeling prevents it from being a cheerful, hearty holiday, though every year makes it even more so, So it's getting there. By the way, in 1870, President Grant did officially make Christmas a national holiday, but it wasn't till after that. It wasn't before that time. And part of it was a mending thing between North and South. What can we do to bring these together in some common celebration? Now, there were some other literary elements that preceded Dickens coming here. We all know this guy, right? Okay, so Washington Irving, best known not only for this, but what else? What other stories? Rip Van Winkle, okay? So the two stories we most associate with him are Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle, Ichabod Crane. All these names are very familiar. What we don't know is he brought us the basic concept that gave us this, okay? And what happened was he wrote under pseudonyms, which a lot of people did, either wrote anonymously or under pseudonyms in the 19th century. And under the pseudonym of Geoffrey Crayon, the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gentleman, this was a book of a series of stories. In this book was Rip Van Winkle and all the Ichabod Cranes, all of that was there, but there were several stories of Christmas that he had gotten from observing various Dutch customs in New York, and he was kind of making fun of it at first, but the idea of Santa being in some kind of a cart and flying over the trees was originated by him. So a lot of people think that this is the beginning of our modern concept of Santa Claus. Now, the next guy that was a part of this, and this was only 3 years later, Clement Moore wrote the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, which we all know as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. And there is a question as to whether Clement Moore really wrote this because it was written anonymously and people didn't know who it was, but in 1837 someone outed him and said, oh yeah, it was Clement Moore, and then 10 years later someone said, no, it was me. So there is some question. There is some question about that. But some really important stuff happened here in the literary world. The images of the jolly old elf with the belly, okay, in red, the little round belly, his 8 tiny reindeer, and the actual naming of the reindeer, okay, all of that was first in this poem, okay? Now, which reindeer was not part of this at this time? Correct. Who wasn't invented until 1939, but that's a different lecture, okay? Okay. I want you to remember, though, this very last part where it goes, Happy Christmas to all and to all a good night. We'll come back to that again later. But anyway, we have these literary precedents, and in many ways, this is the grand triumvirate between Irving and Moore and Dickens, because then in 1843, A Christmas Carol came out, and this was really the capstone. It really kind of solidified all of this idea of a new, different kind of Christmas. We might say a kinder, gentler, family-oriented, non-drunken Christmas. To get ahead of ourselves just a little bit, that was the literary part. As for the visuals of Santa, Thomas Nast, the illustrator, was a big part of creating the vision of Santa as we have it today. This gets too far ahead of us, but does anyone know what company's images of Santa really solidified the modern one? Coca-Cola, absolutely. That comes a lot later, but Coke's ads really created our modern one. Now, we have this whole build, okay, and now we have Dickens coming to Boston for his second trip and final trip. So it was November 19th, 1867, so it was just before Thanksgiving. Curiously, Thanksgiving was another holiday that had only recently become a national holiday. It was in 1863. So Thanksgiving, national holiday in 63, 7 years later, Christmas. But he comes into Boston Harbor on the ship Cuba. They actually grounded and had to send a rowboat out because they got stuck on a little shoal. And he came back, and where did he stay? The Parker House, okay. You're good. Okay, now, people already loved his books, okay? They just adored his books. After the first trip, Americans weren't particularly wild about him because he was critical. He did like the Lowell Mill Girls, but he'd had a lot of criticism, and they were really kind of irate. Everyone had either outgrown that or just got over it, okay, because everyone was loving him and couldn't wait until he arrived. And part of it is that he had written A Christmas Carol after he left the last time. So this meant that the author of one of the books that many, many people adored was coming here and was going to read in person from his book in front of our audiences. So this is what the Parker House looked like in 1867. It is named for Harvey Parker. He opened it in 1855, so this is only 12 years after it was open, but it was already a world-famous place. And when Dickens got off the Cuba, he was brought in, and Harvey greeted him at the door along with his partner, John Mills. Also, one of his local publishers, Jamie Fields, was there, so he was greeted by a very prestigious gang who were all very, very kind to him. I mentioned Jamie Fields. At this time, there was no real international copyright law. And so after A Christmas Carol had come out in 1843, we know of at least a dozen illegal versions of it that were created. In other words, people just got the book from England, copied it, printed it, and sold it, and gave Dickens nothing. And there was no copyright law to prevent that from happening. So what Jamie Fields did, who was part of the famous Old Corner bookstore, Ticknor and Fields, what he did was he created a special diamond edition to celebrate the 25th anniversary of it. And I thought silver was, that's interesting. Why do you call it diamond? Okay, anyway, so he did a special edition and made sure that Dickens got royalties. And in fact, Jamie Fields did that with all his authors, because among the authors that he was publishing were guys like Longfellow, Emerson, Hawthorne, just your basics. And so he was very, very happy. Now, if you don't recognize that building is still there in Boston, but it's a Chipotle. On the positive side, the building is still there. The building was built in 1718. It's the same building. It's been maintained by Historic Boston Incorporated, and they actually It's been a commercial space. I mean, it was a commercial space when it was a bookstore, so they've rented it out for years, and the rent they get from Chipotle helps them to do a whole lot of other historic preservation throughout Greater Boston. And they do have a plan in the works now to renovate it and to make it evident that it is the old corner bookstore, which you wouldn't know just by passing by nowadays. It was, in the 80s and 90s, the Globe Corner Bookstore was a renter there, and people confused that with the Old Corner Bookstore, which is the name of the building, and which is what it was in the 19th century. So the Globe Corner Bookstore was an independent bookseller who worked out of there. They also had an office in Harvard Square, and then they had an online presence. Yeah. So, but yeah, this has been non-book selling certainly since the turn of the 21st century. Yeah. Anyway, so as I mentioned this is Jamie Field's version, gave him royalties, and this was the first known system of royalties in the United States. It was a big deal. Before that, authors were sometimes paid a lump sum, and that was it. It was all over. So it was a really important thing, and Jamie Fields was a huge part of the development of the golden age of American literature, which happened here in the Greater Boston area. His wife also knew that we wanted to make Dickens feel at home. They did everything they could to make him feel like Boston was his home, the Parker House was his home. So she made sure that a lot of the things that weren't really part of American traditions yet, like having mistletoe in your room and little decorations, she made sure that was there. So Dickens just fell in love with the place. Dickens also knew that the Parker House was the place where all these literary guys were hanging out, okay? And this had started happening just a few weeks after the Parker House opened in 1855. If you go in the hallway, in the lobby today, you'll see these three large pictures, framed pictures, and the one in the middle looks like a big white table with names around it. Here's a closer look. The group was called the Saturday Club, and this diagram is a picture of all the prestigious minds, which included great literary minds, who would meet there the last Saturday of every month in this group called the Saturday Club. And they would meet at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they would wine, they would dine, they would talk about things, read things they'd been working on, they would drink, and they would drink some more, and it was a lot of fun. It wasn't just like work or anything of that sort. But you'll see Longfellow at one end, Louis Agassiz at the other end, and many prestigious names, including these guys, Longfellow, Emerson, Holmes. So all of these people were there at the meetings. And so Dickens, I'm sorry? No. Curiously, there were not any women, because in those days there were men's clubs and women's clubs. So Louisa May Alcott and Harriet Beecher Stowe had to go off and do their own thing, okay? However, the largest meeting halls in the mezzanine level of the Parker House are Harriet Beecher Stowe, Louisa May Alcott Ballroom, Isabella Stewart Gardner. So we've made up for their mistakes, yeah. They hung out there. Ladies loved to come there, but the clubs were definitely separate. Anyway, what's interesting is that only a decade before Dickens came, a lot of these guys, nobody in America thought you could make a living by being a writer, okay? And a lot of these guys had day jobs. So Longfellow taught modern languages at Harvard. Nathaniel Hawthorne worked at the Custom House, first in Boston, then up in Salem. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a physician. So a lot of these, we think of them as famous writers, but it actually, what happened was while they were meeting in the Saturday Club, they started talking with James Russell Lowell, yet another member of the Lowell family, and they said, you know what? It takes several years to write books, and so we're going to have to keep our day jobs unless we can figure out a way that you can make a more regular living by writing. So one idea is, why don't you, when you're writing your books, serialize them, and we could print them in some kind of magazine or paper once a month, or you could write shorter stories. But that way, we can create a way that you can make a living and quit your day job. So at a meeting of the Saturday Club at the Parker House, they created the Atlantic Monthly. And that's how and why it was created, as a venue for these people to make a regular living from their writing. So a lot of cool things happening. And Dickens was aware of all of this. Dickens, by the way, had been serializing his stuff in London for years, so he already knew about that grand idea. Now, when he got here, he was very impressed because the Parker House was the nicest place in town. The Tremont House tried to get him back and wrote to him and said, please come in here. He said, no, the Parker House is where I want to be. And he wrote to his daughter. He had many kids. He and his wife had 10 kids. This is an immense hotel with all manner of white marble public passages and public rooms. I live in a corner high up and have a hot and cold bath in my bedroom. That was a big deal, connecting with the sitting room. And comforts not in existence when I was here before. The cost of living is enormous, but happily we can afford it. So, anyway, we do have some images of what it looked like. The Dickens suite. Notice the fireplace, the mantel there. And he actually had a suite with a main door and then 2 doors to the side because his agent Dolby was traveling with him. And there's another image that was printed much later of what the room looked like. Now, the available cuisine, what did Dickens eat? Okay, very important question. We don't know, we're not sure, okay? However, 2 years before he arrived, Harvey Parker, wanting to have the best food in all of Boston, had hired probably the most famous French chef living in the United States at the time, a guy named Augustin Anezin. And it was under Anezin, we know, that Parker House rolls first made their viewing. Okay, and yes, you still get them with every meal today. Okay, what would be the other thing that might have been that the Parker House is famous for? You betcha, okay? So we do know that it was under Anezin that we first saw the appearance of Boston cream pie, although at that time it probably looks more like that, okay? It's this more sophisticated version is the modern one, so, but it was still there. So we think that he must have, because of the times, been able to eat those at the time. Now, Dickens was comparable in his time to a rock star today, okay? For example, people were so excited that he was there that they did have to have guards at his door because people wanted to come up and touch this icon. He also tended to wear this big fur coat with the fur on the outside, and people would come up and grab it because they wanted some of the fur, and they just wanted to have a part of it. So they had to guard him at all times. Which is much like rock stars today. One of the interesting things is, when Dickens spoke, he wasn't just like, didn't have a book and just read out of the book, okay? He was actually trained as an actor. And so what he did, this mirror, which is now at the mezzanine level at the Parker House, and you can go up to it, was in his room. It's a life-size mirror. It's taller, it's like taller than this, probably about 8 feet tall. And he used to practice the parts that he was reading. So if he was reading from A Christmas Carol, which is what everyone wanted to hear at that time, he would be doing all the parts, and he'd be doing Scrooge and Tiny Tim, and he would practice the vocal and all the expressions and the movements. So it was a show. Okay, it wasn't just a reading, it was a whole show. And it was nothing for Dickens to have an audience of 2,000 for one of his readings. Also, well, I'll tell you more about that later, but it was a big performance. Now, the other problem for the people taking care of him is he loved to take long walks. Okay, this was a nightmare for his guards because he said, I want to go out, and if they didn't let him out the front door, he snuck out the back door, and he would walk all over Boston. And he even decided in February of 1868, when it was really, really cold, to have something called the Great International Walking Match. He was quoted as saying, if I could not walk far and fast, I think I should just explode and perish. And the walking match was from downtown Boston to Newton Center and back, okay? So I'm talking about serious walking. And people were, this was great PR as well, but he did it because he felt like he needed to do that. Now, his actual performance, we know that he practiced reading A Christmas Carol at the Parker House. We think that he did it in front of the Saturday Club. They didn't take notes, though, about the meetings, so we're not 100% sure, but we know he read it there. So his first reading of A Christmas Carol in America was at the Parker House, and his first public performance was right around the corner, Tremont Temple, which is still there today. And this is where the 2,000 people crowded in. And this was his setup because, again, he was an actor. He had the whole thing thought out. He traveled with a backdrop stand, a maroon backdrop that he put up there, very intricate gas lighting system because we didn't have electricity then to light it. He had this specially made little podium with a place for his foot on the bottom, and then an abbreviated form of his book. Now, A Christmas Carol isn't that long. It's not even a novel. It's called a novella. But he had an abbreviated version of that he kept there, but it was really mostly a prop because he knew most of the lines, and he could fake the rest of them. But he would do the performance, and the norm would be he would start at 8 o'clock. He would go on for an hour and a half. There'd be a break, and then he would read something shorter for about 20 minutes or half an hour after that. But that was his basic setup. And everyone came to cover it. This was a review by the New York Times, written by a local guy, Charles Taylor, and it was covered by media all over the place. Curiously, again, there's not a credit here. I had to find out who wrote this, but I was able to discover it. Charles Taylor is the guy who became the first publisher of the Boston Globe. But that didn't exist at that time. So this is 1867. The Globe didn't start until 1872. But Taylor was already doing journalism long before he became the publisher. Now, we all know the famous things, okay? We all know bah humbug. We all know God bless us everyone. But does anyone know another phrase that became very, very popular because it was used so frequently in A Christmas Carol? Oh, I liked it as a doornail. Merry Christmas. Okay? Now, remembering back to Clement Moore, how did he end that last line? Happy Christmas to all. Okay? Both happy and merry had been used at various times. Happy was much more popular and was much more common. Dickens wasn't the first person to say Merry Christmas, okay, or to write Merry Christmas, but he wrote it so many times. If you can get a Google copy of the book, like Google Merry, and start looking for it, it's all over the place. It's used many, many times. Everyone agrees that the popularity of merry versus happy in America was because of A Christmas Carol. And to this day, in the UK, what do people usually say? Happy. They generally say happy. Now, he's British, so what's the deal, you know? But we picked up the merry part of it and have been using it ever since. So he is credited with doing that. This is the stuff that kind of capped off. You know, we've been doing this build of Christmas, building and how it's coming back to Boston and how people are accepting it. But the ideas in A Christmas Carol really solidified the Christmas that we're thinking about today. The core message, the importance of charity and goodwill to all humankind. Emphasis, joy, family, merriment. The final message of redemption, one night and Scrooge redoes it all, okay? That's a really nice message, okay? So generally, people credit A Christmas Carol with being like the final, like the tip of the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, or the final part of putting together a modern day Christmas in Boston and in America in general. Now, he didn't just do this in Boston. What he did, you know how when people talk about George Washington, many hotels will advertise, George Washington slept here. It was usually like a night, okay? In this case, he actually had his room, his suite at the Parker House for 5 months. But what he did was he took excursions out, sometimes just day trips, sometimes for 2 or 3 days, but he maintained his suite at the Parker House. And he did an insane schedule. This is a map up to Portland, out to Buffalo, down to Washington. He had meant to do even more, like Chicago, Canada, but he was not feeling well. He had flu-like symptoms. He also had a problem with his foot. I would imagine so with all the walking. And anyway, so it was a very, very ambitious tour, and he brought this message and these feelings to a broad area. His very last performance in Boston, when he still had the suite, was on April 8th, 1868. He did his reading again. The audience went wild because they knew it was his final performance. And he ended it by saying, "In this brief life of ours, it is sad to do almost anything for the last time. Ladies and gentlemen, I beg most earnestly, most gratefully, and most affectionately to bid you each and all farewell." And everyone was, in tears. He got really rich here. By some accounts, what he made in that time was about $2 million. I know nowadays maybe that's not a big deal. Back then, he made a huge amount of money. But his health was not great when he arrived. It was much poorer when he left because of the strenuous tour he'd been on. And 2 years later, he died, and he was only 58. Okay? So, he wanted to be buried in a very simple place. His friends said, no, you're too important. And so he was buried in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey. Now, the things left behind. Because he was so important and everyone knew he was so important, the Parker House did, and many people maintained vestiges of his trips. So to this day, you can go into the Dickens suite, which is not the suite that he was in. I need to explain this. The Parker House was built in 1855. They did expansions in 1866, in 1885, in 1895. They kept expanding and expanding and expanding. And then by the 1920s, everybody looked at it and went, "This is garish, it's Victorian, it's too ornate, it's ugly." And so what they did was they tore down the bulk of the Parker House and rebuilt the current Parker House on its footprint. However, there was one annex that was more recent and was fireproofed and was very modern, and that was left open. And it had 80 rooms in it. And so during the period when they were tearing down and rebuilding the Parker House, people stayed in those 80 rooms, which allow us to be the oldest continuously operating hotel in the United States because we never shut down. Okay? There are some other hotels in other states that are older, but when they had their renovation, they shut down for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Okay? Anyway, so even though we have the Dickens mantle, it's not in his room because it isn't the same hotel. Okay? The same thing with the mirror. That was in his room. That's now in the mezzanine. But you can still go there and you can practice in front of it if you'd like. Now, we also do have the door to his original suite, but this is a really interesting story. So 1925, they begin tearing down the Parker House. 1926, this guy from the McNutt Demolition Company is in there being told to just take everything and throw it out. And he comes to this really, really tall wooden door that has a sign on it that said, "This is the door to Dickens' suite in 1867. And also that Charlotte Cushman lived there because the great actress Charlotte Cushman stayed in that suite, actually lived there until her death. And anyway, so this guy from the company looked at this and said, "I'm supposed to throw everything out, but this seems important." And so he picked it up and went, "Where can I take this?" And someone said, "Well, there's a historic society around the corner at the old State House, the Bostonian Society." So he picked it up, took it over to the old State House, gave it to them. They said, "Thank you." And the Bostonian Society took it and put it in storage for 90 years. Okay? In 2015, I get a phone call. "Hi, are you the house historian?" "Uh-huh. We've got something of yours." And so they took me up to one of these nondescript buildings up in Haverhill that have like storage in various floors and you rent rooms. And we found this battered old door that was the door to Dickens' suite. And so we brought it back, did some negotiations. They gave it to us, but it took a lot of paperwork because of ownership, whatever. And they gave it to us, and then we cleaned it up and had a wonderful unveiling ceremony. If you see in the upper right-hand picture, if you think that looks like Tip O'Neill, that's because it's his son Tommy. Okay, Tip O'Neill was not alive in 2015. Anyway, so we had this grand ceremony and then built this beautiful glass case for it, and it's sitting in our historical gallery in the basement. So we do have the Dickens store, so it's really neat. By the way, I'm not supposed to call it the basement, it's the lower level lobby. And a few months ago, I was taking a tour there, and I brought some people there, and I explained that this was the Dickens door, and this guy went, That's really weird. I went, what? He said, why would Dickens stay in the basement? So it was on the 3rd floor where Dickens stayed. Now, because he had such an affinity, because this is the place that's most associated with Dickens, his descendants have periodically come to visit the Parker House and do special events there. One of these in 1999, all of these are great-greats. Great-great-grandson Gerald Charles Dickens came and visited and did readings. 2005, Mark Dickens, another great-great, came. And then in 2017, it was actually the 150th anniversary of his first reading A Christmas Carol. And so Gerald came back, and we had a great party. We took the entire rooftop ballroom, put ballroom tables around, served a meal that would be comparable to what Dickens would have had, and Gerald did a reading from A Christmas Carol, and it was an amazing event. It was truly wonderful. He is also a trained actor, so he did an amazing job. So it was great. Now, I told you we'd return to these mills, okay? There is a question about origins, and let me explain this. We already mentioned that back in 1842, he was quite impressed with the Lowell Mill girls. He was quite impressed with how clean it was, how neat it was, how well taken care of the girls were, how they were given cultural events, could go to lectures, could do even writing. And one of the things that the Lowell Mill girls did was that they created a magazine called the Lowell Offering, in which many of the women who were would-be authors wrote short stories, and they published this. And it was a big deal. It was apparently a wonderful magazine. And when he visited, he loved the girls, they loved him, and they said, we want to give you our magazines. So he left with a stack with copies of every single magazine that they'd published at that time. And we know from Dickens' writings that he read every one because he really loved them. However, among the themes that you could find in these magazines are stories of ghosts, of stories of taking tours through your own past, of a troubled individual's life, sudden reconsideration of his life and turning it around, not to mention a variety of phrases that were in these magazines that then appeared in A Christmas Carol. This is relatively recent research. This is Natalie McKnight, who's a professor at Boston University. This is an event we had at the Parker House. We started to try to replicate the old Saturday Club meetings with the long tables and people, and except that we would have speakers in. And Natalie came in and spoke to our group about the research she'd done. If you want to read more about it, just Google Lowell Mill Girls and Dickens, and you'll find plenty of articles that have details about this. And she does lectures and slideshows, and she is a true Dickens expert, and I highly recommend it. And Dickens scholars, some of them are really upset and deny everything. Some of them go, well, this is really interesting. Didn't everybody steal from everyone? You know, and the thing is it theft? Is it inspiration? You know, the fact is, none of us read the Lowell Mill Girls today, and all of us keep reading A Christmas Carol. So there were other elements besides a few themes. But it is interesting to know that it does come back to the mills, and that that we are partly responsible for A Christmas Carol. Now, there are people who think that the Parker House is haunted. I'm not going to share all the stories with you. I personally have never had an encounter with a ghost at the Parker House, but I am in charge of collecting stories. And as early as 1992, I used to write history columns for the Boston Globe, and I got to interview the bellman, John Brem, who'd been working there at that time for 50 years. And he was the first one that told me about elevator number 1. Now, when you go into the Parker House, there is a battery of 4 elevators, number 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they're all very beautiful and embossed. And, you know, the nice thing about the Parker House is when they rebuilt it in 1925, it was kind of modern and Bauhaus on the outside, but they always kept the inside looking like the 19th century. And it's still true to this day. Anyway, he told me about elevator number 1 and said, this has been happening as long as anyone can remember, that periodically, elevator number 1 gets called, the bell rings, and it gets called to the 3rd floor, but there's nobody there. And sometimes it happens twice a week, and sometimes it doesn't happen for 2 years. And Otis Elevator has come in and checked it many times. There's nothing wrong with the elevator. Dickens stayed on the 3rd floor. And so the legend has grown up that perhaps, well, okay, for people who believe in ghosts, they often say there are 2 reasons that ghosts are in a place. One is unfinished business, and one is they just really like the place. We don't think Dickens had any unfinished business, but we do know that he really, really liked the place. So if in fact, this phenomena, this is one of our associates did this little cartoon of him standing in front, deciding about the elevators. Anyway, if in fact, take it as you will. Come and try our #1 elevator and see whatever happens. Oh, the other theory is, I mentioned that after he left, the actress Charlotte Cushman took over, and she actually lived. People used to live in hotels. Actually, we're doing that again, aren't we? Yeah. But in the 19th century, it was very common for someone's home to be the hotel. And she lived there and she died there, so I think it's actually more likely it's her. But I could be wrong. Anyway, back to our initial premise. I don't know if you ever saw this movie. In 2017, the movie came out, The Man Who Invented Christmas. And it was like Dickens invented Christmas. By the way, my favorite part, Dickens was played by Dan Stevens. Do you remember him from somewhere else? Yes, Matthew. Matthew, Lady Mary's husband in Downton Abbey. Okay. Anyway, so this isn't true, okay? Dickens did not invent Christmas, okay? Period, end story. However, he was really an important part, a vital, vital part of the evolution from this to this, okay? So that is the story, and God blesses everyone. I have to show you one more slide. I didn't know if I should include this. I couldn't help it. Okay, this is the part where you get to ask me questions and I answer. Yes?
I read somewhere a couple years ago that Charles Dickens said during that time when people copied his books and made money off of it, that he sued a publisher and the publisher ended up going bankrupt because of the lawsuit or something?
The question is, we already mentioned that he was pirated by a variety of people. I do know that he sued, but I actually don't remember that part about whether he actually made that publisher go under. But yes, he did sue. Yeah. Yes.
Charles Dickens also kept working on Christmas Carol, each edition of all, because I have an earlier copy and later, and there are differences.
Yes. He did tweak his manuscript over and over again. And that was pretty common at the time in general. Yes. He did. So the question was, did he tweak the manuscript because there are different versions of it? Yes.
In what circumstances and where did he observe slavery?
You're going to have to read American Notes. What specific plantations or areas? I mean, he went through much of the South, through the Carolinas. Yes. So, I mean, he wasn't observing slavery up here because it had already been abolished. Massachusetts was the first state to abolish slavery. It would happen in 1783. That was good. So it wasn't up here, it was in the South. I don't know if there are any Vermonters here. Vermont was the first colony to abolish slavery, but it wasn't a state when it abolished it. It's like, okay. Yes?
I believe it was Francis Cabot-Lowell's father who wrote the clause in the Massachusetts Constitution that abolished slavery.
Wow.
It was John Lowell, Judge John Lowell, and he was a member of the Continental Congress, and he was one of the authors of the Massachusetts Constitution.
Wow. See, it keeps coming back to Lowell and the Mills, and I love that. Okay, are there any other questions? Okay. You are a really smart audience and a great audience. Thanks a lot.